Have you ever been playing Skyrim and run into a situation kind of something like this? You go into a dungeon, you beat the boss, you step over his cold lifeless body, pretend it doesn't bother you, head into the loot room to claim your loot chest, and then in that chest you find a spell book. Thanksgiving. Fantastic. On the cover is a symbol of a school of magic, one that you're pretty sure you understand the general gist of, and then you read this spell's name, but it doesn't seem like it should be in that school of magic. It kind of seems a lot more similar to this other school of magic that you know. So you decide to test it out, and sure enough, it does exactly what it says on the tin, further cementing that this spell shouldn't be in the school the game has it in at all. If you think you're alone in that experience, don't worry, I've been through the exact same thing for the past 14 years. I'm stuck in purgatory and I can't get out. And as far as I can tell, I'm not the only one, if the results online or anything to go by. And some of you who may not be so familiar with the spells in the game might think that this is probably not a big issue, right? I mean, so what? A couple of spells are a bit finicky with their categories. Who cares, right? It's not a couple of spells. Try a metric ton of spells that have this issue. There are a lot of spells that seem to not fit in their school whatsoever, and there are even more which may seem to fit in their school alright at first look, but actually seem to fit in multiple schools alright if you look twice. I mean, look at Ward. Why is that in Restoration? Shouldn't that be an alteration with the rest of the Mage Armor Protection spells? What about if I hit you over the head with a bucket using Telekinesis? Wouldn't that be in Destruction instead of Alteration? And while we're on Alteration, what the hell does that even mean? Oh, it's the category for spells that are about altering reality. Oh, I'm sorry. Isn't that what all magic is doing? I mean, when's the last time you popped a fireball out of your ass just for the fuck of it? I didn't realize that was a thing we could all do with the regular non-altering reality spells. I mean, what the hell is going on with the spells in Skyrim? And that's a great question. The problem is, for 14 years, I didn't have the answer to that question. I ran into the issue as a wee lad of 11 years old, and I promptly put it to the back of my ass. I did not know, and more importantly, I did not care. I just chalked it up to the silly little developers not knowing their own game and being lazy and sucking at writing or whatever. But what if I told you that now I do have an answer to that question? And what if I told you that there's actually a bigger problem now, a bigger question now, a spell so dastardly, so badly out of position, it completely breaks the schools of magic as I knew them, and it's one of the most innocuous spells you might never have guessed it was. Candlelight. The spell is Candlelight. Of all the ones that could be messing everything up, why is it Candlelight and not, I don't know, like a fucking literal nuke that nobody uses because it sucks ass, or a spell that lifts a man 2 inches off of his fucking feet and then gently sets him back down again that's so goddamn dangerous for some reason that multiple international organizations decided it need to be banned. For some reason, it's not the ones that are odd or obvious. It's Candlelight. You know, the one that lights up a damn room. I didn't make the motherfucking rules, okay? So naturally, the next question, of course, is why? Why? What is Candlelight doing that it's so bad that it's fucking the steez up for everything, man? And I'm gonna throw you a bone here. I'll tell you, obviously. I'm gonna throw you a bone here first. Give you a chance to feel good about yourself, you know? See, I'm gonna give you a hint. See if you can figure it out for yourself, and if you do, hey, feel free to brag about it down below in the comments. You know what I'm saying? Hell yeah, brother. And by the way, check this out. Even if you don't get it, you know what I'm saying? Even if you can't figure it out from the hint, you can just go to when I say the answer in the video and then go back to this point right now and then still go down to the comments and go, hell yeah, dog, I totally figured that out for myself. And nobody will know because you can just lie. You can just do that. But anyways, I will reveal to you the answer in due time. But first, why is Ward in Restoration and why is Telekinesis always an alteration? It's always dumbass questions like this that I see get asked a lot. Personally, I think these questions are damn wrong. I think they're what they call an inductive fallacy. Yes, and I'm gonna let you know, if you don't know what an inductive fallacy is, it's like when you draw a general conclusion from like a specific piece of evidence that isn't as supportive of that conclusion that you think that evidence is. That's what an inductive fallacy is. So, you know, keep that in mind when I'm walking you through what's going on with this damn Skyrim spell system, right? And I'm gonna show you an example of what I mean by inductive fallacy. And what better example, what better volunteer to use for this example than the spell Candlelight, since you know it happens to be in a place of mysteriousness and mystique at the moment. When we look at the spell Candlelight, it seems to be a spell which, of course, is summoning a light. As simple as that may seem, it's pretty important to what's going on here, because obviously what spells seem to be doing is very important to the questions of like why is ward and restoration, because that's what the presupposition is. You know what I'm saying? That people look at what the spells are doing in like restoration, for an example. They look at ward and that it seems to be casting a magical barrier, and then they go and look at the mage armor spells in alteration, and they seem to also be casting some sort of magical barrier. So therefore, these two should be in the same category, right? That's what the crux of this misconception is the presupposition that what the spell seems to be doing is important. So walk with me for a second. We're gonna walk down Candlelight together, me and you, to look at what Candlelight seems to be doing, and we're gonna draw a conclusion on whether or not Candlelight deserves to be in its category. This is gonna be, okay, I should warn you, this is gonna be a little bit nerdy. This is gonna get a little bit scientific here. So if you ain't with that, sorry to tell you, brother, that's what's gonna happen. We got 3 things that I think can really let us know what Candlelight is doing. And the 3 things are this. We know how light works in real life. We can look at the spell in-game to see if it's conforming to that idea of how we know light forms in real life. And we also have the spell's category. And obviously that'll play a big part in whether or not it deserves to be in that category based off of how it could be being cast. Okay, so let's walk down the first thing first. How light works in real life. We know how light works in real life. And when we say light, by the way, we mean visible light. There's many different forms of light, most of which we can't interpret, or more colloquially put, we can't see them. There's things like X-rays, microwaves, infrared, all that sort of stuff, right? Just for an example of other things, other forms of light that aren't visible to humanity. Well, they're visible to humanity. They're just not visible to humans. And I guess I should also say this. The most simple way to differentiate the two, from visible light and other forms of light is probably just to say that they all exist on the same spectrum, but they have a different measurement on that spectrum. And in this case, the measurement is called frequency. And it's not like we just can't see past a certain barrier frequency, kind of like with hearing. Sometimes, most people can't hear past a certain frequency of hearing, of sound. In this case, infrared has a lower frequency than visible light, but X-rays have a higher frequency than visible light because there's a sweet spot frequency that visible light rests in, and if something is producing that specific sweet spot frequency, we're able to interpolate it, right? Cool. And there's 2 things that radiate light at this sweet spot frequency that give us visible light. The first is incandescence, which is kind of like thermal radiation. You can think of it kind of like fire or the sun or lightning. That sort of thing. The second thing is kind of like, well, it's not kind of like, it is luminescence. And that's sort of like more chemical, as I understand it. Phosphorescence, which is kind of like those, glow in the dark stars you stick in your child's bedroom, and then it falls off in the middle of the night, smacks him in the head, thinks a roach is on him, and then they run into your room and wake your ass up because your stupid ass didn't put enough fucking glue or whatever the hell you needed to put on it. You didn't realize that a popcorn ceiling is not really the most conducive to sticking shit to it. So look, man, maybe you should just understand general contracting principles and the materials used to build your home before you start fucking sticking shit in your child's fucking ceiling and giving them goddamn post-traumatic stress disorder for the rest of their fucking life. I'm not one to judge your parenting. I'm just saying, we have the science to explain why that's a bad idea. Anyway, so phosphorescence is one of the sides of luminescence, and one of the things that luminescence can have. And like another example would be like electroluminescence, which is just, things like LEDs or electroluminescence, right? Just getting luminescence through electricity, right? All of that, I guess, very detailed, very nerdy. All of that is to say that we know how light works in real life, and now you do too. Fantastic. At least very basically, as far as this example needs to go into detail for. So, we know how light works in real life. Let's combine it with the other 2 things to see what we can get. The second thing, of course, we look at the spell's representation in-game. The important thing to note here is we want to see exactly how much of the natural process to get light seems to be getting changed from what we know of it. When we look at the light in-game, it looks like a light, dog. I don't really know what you want from me. I guess I don't really know what I was expecting, but it seems good enough for me, I guess. I kind of think there's no real conclusion we can draw just from looking at this and peering at this orb floating in fucking space here. So what we should do is go look at the third thing, and hopefully that'll let us know what the fucking second thing is doing. The third thing, of course, in this case, is the spell's category. Candlelight is an alteration, which means that, since alteration is about altering reality, some part of the natural process to get light must be getting supplicated with magic. We know that that because otherwise it doesn't deserve to be an alteration. So when we look back at the in-game representation, I still think there's a couple of things it could be, but if we go with Occam's razor here, I think what the Candlelight spell is most likely doing is it is changing the first part of the process to get visible light. It isn't creating a new sweet spot frequency, if you want, like right next to visible light as we know it, and then allowing us to see that. It's probably just adding a third method alongside incandescence and luminescence, like just called magic right there, right? That's what it's probably doing, in my eyes at least. Just hijacking the system that we have and just modifying the first part of it, which is kind of cool to figure out. If you think that's, if you agree with me, I think that's a cool thing to think. Now, all of that is just to say that in Skyrim's case, it does in fact appear that Candlelight deserves to be an alteration. But how is that a problem, you're asking? What part of that is a logical, or what part of that is an inductive fallacy? Well, first off, that's not the inductive fallacy. I'll let you know when we get to that part. But the problem with this is a key phrase that I've said here. I don't know if you caught it. I said, in Skyrim. Yes. In Skyrim, Candlelight is an alteration. But the thing about Candlelight is in Oblivion, it's an illusion. And that's pretty interesting because that means that if Candlelight is doing the exact same thing it's doing in Skyrim, well then obviously it's a problem because it's not an alteration. It's not altering reality, so of course it will be wrong. So let's go look at it. Let's catch it red-handed, right? Shall we? We still have the same exact three things. The only thing that have changed is the spell's representation in game and also the school's category that we've already talked about. So we already know how light works. We don't have to rediscuss that. What we actually need to do is check whether or not this light in-game seems to be real. That's all we need to know. If it isn't real, then we know it belongs in illusion and there's no problem. And, well, you see it, brother. It's a real fucking light. I don't know. You fucking see it. Look at it. It's clearly lighting up both the room and this random homeless lady in Jaden Hall just trying to catch a winkle of sleep here. I don't know what more you want from me. That's a fucking light. If I'm in a room that is pitch dark, I can't see nothing, and also, very key here, I don't know what this room looks like, then the only way I can cast a light and have that light be fake, but also still show me what that room looks like, is to make up what that room looks like. I won't know what it actually is until I see it, but I can't see it until an actual light gets in there. And this is exactly how the spell works in Oblivion. So essentially, this means it's a problem, right? It shouldn't be an illusion. So does that mean that this is what's wrong with Candlelight after all? No, and I'll get to that in due time just like I said, but this is the inductive fallacy that I mentioned. It seems to be a problem that Candlelight is an illusion in Oblivion because it doesn't seem to be doing what the category says it should. And I think this is an excellent example, if I do say so myself, of how people come to the conclusions that certain spells don't fit to their specific categories. The people who come to these conclusions kind of view the schools of magic much like an equation, if you want, where to the right of the equal sign is a spell and whatever it's doing, and that therefore the schools of magic must classify themselves based off of what their spells are doing within. And I think this is an inductive fallacy because you are presupposing that because, in your view, a spell's operation is dictated in part by which school it's in, that therefore the schools must classify themselves by what the spells are doing. That's like saying, cats have tails, therefore cats are made for balance. You know what I'm saying? That's not how it works. In that logic, you could have picked anything about the schools and reached a similar conclusion to that, Which is already pretty inductive as reasonings go, but it gets worse, in my opinion. The fact is, the only thing that could back up that claim is another claim that somebody who controls the implementation of the system must have made a mistake in the spell's classification, because that's clearly what you're suggesting. And there's two groups of people who that could be. The first is the developers, and can we seriously just agree that this isn't what's happening? Because if it's true that that's what is happening and they've made a mistake, then literally anything ever in the lore can just be waved away and doubted simply because the devs have made a mistake before. So I'm pretty much going to say no to that basically every time. The only other people who it could be would be the people of Tamriel. And while it's a completely fair thing to suggest that the people are misusing their own system, actually with some fairly decent anecdotal evidence to support that claim, it doesn't change the fact that it isn't really something that we can say for true. If you heard that, that was me rolling my pant legs up. It's getting hot in here, man. I'm taking my bandana off. Meaning at best, it's a strong anecdotal piece of evidence, which you're then using to support your inductive fallacy. It's just not really the greatest mindset, in my opinion. So all of that is a very, very long-winded way to say that questions like, why is ward and restoration don't really make sense, which is, kind of really sad, honestly, because that's like the exact way I viewed the schools of magic for my entire time playing Skyrim. Like, I was introduced to Elder Scrolls through Skyrim. Since I was 11, I thought of them like that. And honestly, even to this day, even though they don't end up actually working like that, I still think that is kind of a way cooler system to be in. And the conclusions you can come to about what specific spells are doing, to get their results, I think it's kind of a really fun exercise. But ultimately, again, I don't really think it works like that, sadly. But it also spawns a few questions of its own. Namely is the question of, if the schools aren't categorizing themselves based off of what their spells can do, then what do they classify themselves by? And don't worry, I'll answer that too, eventually, but in due time. Everything's in due time with me in this fucking video. I said I had to fucking get shit done, and I've just put everything on the back burner. It is what it is, fuck it. I am who I am, I ain't gonna apologize. But it's important to remember, we just went through all of that. Everything that I just talked about, figuring out how light works, what their categories are in. The only reason we talked about that was simply to understand why it's an inductive fallacy, because that's a common misconception that a lot of people have. But what we're really talking about here, what this entire video is sort of framed from the perspective of, is Candlelight. And, how it's gonna shake up my entire understanding of how the schools work, right? Yeah, that's what you're following. So what is the thing about Candlelight? I did tell you that I would answer it, and I'm willing to. I'll do it for you right now, even. No more beating around the bush, I swear, okay? The thing is, I've actually kind of already showed you what the issue is, just not directly. I did use it as a volunteer to help you understand the earlier inductive fallacy, after all. That was the hint, by the way, not the image I showed you at the time, if that's what you thought it was. But okay, the thing with Candlelight is that it's in 2 schools. And, that is true, of course, but there's kind of a little bit more to it than that. It isn't, obviously, that it's in 2 schools in general. There have been many spells that have been a part of more than one school before. The thing with Candlelight is that it's in 2 different schools, which both exist at the exact same time. A little bit more beating around the bush, you know what I'm saying? But I got there in the end. I had to make it dramatic, you know what I'm saying? Get off my fucking, cut me some slack. And it isn't a problem, by the way. I'm not sure if that's what you thought. In fact, kind of to the contrary, it's actually going to prove to be very useful pretty soon here. Now, as for why it's so good, basically, it's kind of special, even amongst a lot of the other spells which have been in more than one school before. And to really understand why it's so special, I think I should give you a little bit of backstory on the schools themselves. We haven't really talked about that yet. The schools are kind of an interesting thing, and I think that people who would, commit that earlier inductive fallacy would view the schools as being very hard set, not very subject to change, and therefore allowed to contain whole concepts behind which schools or spells can be categorized, right? But I think, unfortunately, what we see is that they're not very hard set at all. They're actually quite flexible in some ways. For starters, let's look at the fact that in Skyrim, there are 5 schools of magic, but these aren't actually the only schools of magic. In Oblivion, for an example, there were 6 schools of magic. We had the same 5 that we have in Skyrim, but we also had a 6th school called mysticism. And you can kind of think of mysticism as, it's kind of like alteration, but instead of altering how reality works, it sort of is more altering how magic works. And this is interesting. Why is mysticism not in Skyrim? In my opinion, there are 2 things that could be the reason. The first is, for whatever reason, the people of Tamriel, all of the people of Tamriel no longer think mysticism is a valid school in which to practice. I don't really subscribe to that idea. I kind of prefer the second one, and I'll tell you why. The second one is, for whatever reason, just the people of Skyrim do not recognize the school of mysticism. And whether that's specifically the educational institution of the College of Winterhold, or generally all of or most of the people of Skyrim do not recognize mysticism anymore. And I think the reason why this is more likely is because I think there's a school which is a better example that fits more closely with the first idea. These 6 schools that we just talked about are actually still not all the schools that have ever been. All the way back in Elder Scrolls 2, Daggerfall, there were still 6 schools of magic, but instead of conjuration, we had thaumaturgy. And it wasn't like these 2 were interchangeable. The wiki defines thaumaturgy as magic that is not changing the appearance or structure of a force or object, but can manipulate laws temporarily. And, that is kind of confusing when you don't understand what it's referencing by all these specific terms, appearance or structure, force or object, laws, and temporarily, basically the entire fucking definition. As far as what this means for us, it just means that it was closer to alteration or mysticism than it was conjuration. So don't get it confused. Conjuration was replacing thaumaturgy. That's not really what was happening. Following the events of Daggerfall and something called the Warp in the West, which was basically just the events of the game of Daggerfall, thaumaturgy fell from prominence. Essentially, people stopped using it, and then conjuration grew in prominence, meaning people used it a lot more than they did. And the reason I think this is a better fit for the first idea, because we have 3 different games in 3 different provinces and set increasingly later than Daggerfall in each iteration since that game came out. And in each of those, we have not seen thaumaturgy whatsoever, which means that nobody in those areas has recognized thaumaturgy for the entirety of that time. Quite some time, actually. It's about 220 years from what I can gather, which to me sounds like the first idea, right? But the reason I think mysticism isn't like thaumaturgy is because mysticism is actually older than all the other schools, at least in terms of their widespread understanding, like their first widespread introduction to the general public. Because mysticism was made by a group of mages called the Psijic Order. If you've played Skyrim's mage questline, you've heard of them. They're sort of mysteriousness and mystiqueness or whatever. They're the people who take the orb away, the Eye of Magnus away. And while mysticism was made by the Psijic Order, the other schools were generally recognized to the general public by an institution called the Mages Guild of Cyrodiil. And the person who made the Mages Guild, or at least was a heavy hand in making it, they were a part of the Psijic Order before the Mages Guild was ever made. We have a guy who made the Mages Guild being a part of the order that made mysticism before the Mages Guild was made. So essentially, in terms of the widespread application of all these schools, mysticism is older. It's not quite like thaumaturgy. By the way, that person who made the Mages Guild, his name is Vanus Galarian, and he's considered one of the most powerful and influential mages of all time, which means that mysticism was around before the other schools were widely recognized, but also that it was a school that the guy who made the Mages Guild practiced growing up, and he lived and died about 1,000 years ago. So the Mages Guild would have carried that school through 1,000 years of its history and then suddenly decided it wasn't worth it anymore. I mean, it's definitely possible, of course. I just don't think it's very likely, especially when you consider that mysticism has always been kind of controversial. Like, not everybody has recognized mysticism as a proper school, mainly on account of it being so goddamn esoteric. I mean, what the fuck does it mean to alter magic itself? And this is kind of a thing that I have, right? Like, if I walk up to you and I don't know you, I don't know what you get into, you're just a guy. I walk up to you, I ask you, hey dog, how you doing? You say, all right. I ask you what your name is. You say like Fred or some bullshit. And I say, hey, what do you do for a living, Fred? And you say, I study in the magical school of mysticism. I'll probably be at first like, hell yeah, dog, that's dope. But mainly because I don't know what the fuck mysticism is. Like, if I walked up to a dude and he told me that he was a spiritual guy, I wouldn't go, you dumb bitch. I just ask him, what the fuck do you mean by spiritual? You know what I'm saying? Like, I'm not about to hate your entire existence because I don't know what the fuck you're talking about. So I'm asking you, what is mysticism? And then you got the gall to say to me, you baddie motherfucker, that mysticism is the magic of altering magic. That's like saying every now and again your house turns into a horse just for the fuck of it. That don't make no damn sense. That's not how systems work. You know what I'm saying? A system is a system. If the system can change itself, that's a part of the system. It's actually not changing itself at all. It's just like temporarily manipulating itself, or maybe not temporarily, who knows? But that's its function. Like, if you cut your fucking arm off, you're insane. But you can still just cut your arm off. You can't say, oh, actually, I'm using the system to change the system. It's like, no, you've just cut your fucking arm off, right? Clearly to me, as a person who has no fucking clue what mysticism is really about, it seems to me that they don't understand mysticism enough to explain it. And that's okay. Maybe they're just fucking, retaining company secrets or some shit. It don't bother me. Keep your fucking secrets. I wasn't curious in the first place. I was just really asking because I wanted to respect your life experiences. You know what I'm saying? If I want my life experiences of fucking eating too much goddamn French toast in the morning to be respected, well, then I gotta ask you and respect yours too. I've got off on a tangent. Hold on. Where was I at? Right. Mysticism has always been kind of controversial. I think for the kind of concept that it's like not very well understood. And if you listen to my fucking rant, you kind of understand why. I don't get it. A lot of people don't get it. And a lot of people don't recognize it as a quote unquote proper school because of that. Whether you agree with that, I don't really care. but that's the truth of the matter. So what this means, essentially, to reel it back in, what this means is that mysticism has been around for a long time, but it's also not been very well understood for the entirety of its existence. So much so that many people don't recognize it as a proper school. So essentially, you have an institution which was founded by a guy who was raised on mysticism, allegedly, and then they kept that same school a part of their curriculum for 1,000 or so years, give or take a few, we understand, but then they just sort of dropped it at the last moment for seemingly no fucking reason. You know what I'm saying? Maybe there was some big shift in the changing of people's minds about magic since the Oblivion Crisis kind of seemed like a bunch of fucking magic. It was really, I mean, I guess it kind of was magic too, but I wouldn't go about blaming that on magic just because some fucking big-ass red butt-cheeked man stepped out of the sky and started to, you know, destroy my home or whatever. I'd probably be more upset at him about that, you know? Anybody can have a gun, but if you point yours at me, I might have a problem with that, you know what I'm saying? Anyways, again, let me not get on a tangent. Basically, thaumaturgy, we have no evidence. No, I should say it like this. I have no evidence. I have no evidence to suggest that thaumaturgy was, you know, more or less understood or is as controversial as mysticism. It's perfectly reasonable in my idea that people are not using thaumaturgy because they just don't like it no more. That shit is mega garbage boner juice. And now, I can't believe that's like the most Gen Alpha shit I ever said. Not the diss on Gen Alpha, by the way. I don't really like it when people shit talk the like younger generation. Whoa, brother, this is a fucking tangent. Thaumaturgy went away because it sucks. Conjuration came up because it's hot baller ass. Mysticism is still practiced by the Mages Guild in Cyrodiil, but not the College of Winterhold, or at least that's my idea. Holy fuck, dude. Read the goddamn script. Let's get this fucking thing going. The biggest thing that we can sort of take away from this is that people don't really seem to have this unified perspective or opinion on the schools of magic already. But how does all this talk about the history of the schools mean that Candlelight is special? Well, if you recall, what I said about Candlelight, that it's in 2 schools at the exact same time, most other spells that have existed in more than one school have done so because when a school collapsed, like we see thaumaturgy do, they needed some place to go. And the fact that they could shift kind of proves further that they're not as limiting as that original concept of why is Ward and Restoration was. But Candlelight exists in 2 schools, and both of those schools have never collapsed. Alteration and Illusion have been around since the very beginning of the schools being sort of widely considered. So essentially, now we have to figure out, why can Candlelight be in 2 schools? It's a different question entirely to know that the schools don't limit themselves by what spells are in them, but it's an entirely different thing to consider why they can be in 2 different schools at the same time. If we follow this line of reasoning, therefore, maybe we could understand something more about how the schools actually do classify themselves. So I think now, let's try to see what we might be able to figure out by considering some of the mistakes that were made in the earlier fallacy. If there's anything that really bothers me about that fallacy, they seem to kind of have worked backwards. You know, if you think of spellcasting as a process, then wouldn't the spell, or at least the result of the spell, be at the end? And you know, honestly, you can kind of be argued that a spell is its result. Sure, there's probably something in the middle of you casting the general concept of the name of the spell, and then it's shooting out and touching a man and giving him convulsions and conniptions for the rest of his life. But regardless, even if it isn't the result, it's certainly not the first part of the process to spell casting. On the opposite end, at the beginning of the spell casting would obviously be the mage, right? Like they're the person who casts the spell. And so I think if we kind of flip this, instead of working from backwards forwards, what if we work from the front to the back? We work from the mage casting the spell and see if that can let us know what the schools are doing. We need there to be something a mage always has when casting magic, but also have that thing be capable of changing into one of 5 things whenever, you know, they decide to cast in a different school, perhaps. And as it happens, I believe I have the answer. What do you know? It's almost like I wrote a fucking script. The answer is intention. Another way to interpret these definitions would be to say that the mage's intention when they started casting was to change the laws of reality, or, you know, do any one of the other definitions. This would explain why Candlelight is in 2 schools at the same time, because it's not the same spell at all. They've forcibly and fundamentally changed the spell at its inception. It was changed because the mage's intention when starting the spell was different. If you view the schools of magic from this, it kind of makes a lot of sense. And if that's what you thought, then unfortunately, you've kind of walked right into my trap card. While intention seems to work from the perspective of the 7 schools that we have, it's actually like 10 times worse than the first idea. Because if you thought that the schools were limiting in the first fallacy, well then, do you mean to tell me, this is rhetorical, but do you mean to tell me that 7 schools are supposedly enough to cover every single intention a mage could possibly have? That doesn't make any sense whatsoever when you phrase it like that, does it? Even though the intention idea seems to answer one of the symptoms of our problem very well, it actually doesn't answer the other symptom whatsoever. The problem we have is that we don't know what's going on with the schools of magic, but the 2 symptoms that we have is that 1, we don't know how schools are classifying themselves, and 2, there seems to be some issues with how the schools are actuating themselves in the world. The fact that schools are going away, the fact that spells are in 2 different schools, and seem not to fit some schools altogether, that sort of idea. And neither what the spells are doing, nor the intention of the mage answer both. So essentially, what is the thing that singly answers both symptoms of our problem? That's what we need. Did you catch it? I don't know if you did. Hold on, I'll redo it. So what is the thing that singly answers both symptoms of our problem? Of our single Yeah, the question's erroneous. The question, it's a wrong question. We don't have 2 symptoms of one problem. We have 2 different problems. And before I get to answering you about what the solution for both problems is, I should probably give you a little backstory at this point on the how, or essentially why I'm even talking about this. So, about a month and a half ago, I was sitting on my living room couch while making a hot pizza. And I was just sort of thinking, how is Candlelight getting its result? What is it doing? Like, what part of the process to get light is it changing to get the result we see in Skyrim? I don't know if I've made this abundantly clear at this point, but the people who have done these fallacies that I'm referencing is me. I've done both of these fallacies. That was all yours truly. I wasn't even thinking about it from the perspective of like, why isn't Ward in Restoration? I wasn't considering the fact that Candlelight was in 2 different categories because I hadn't really remembered it at that point. I just wanted to know what the spell was doing. And as I said at the beginning of the video, that I had this misconception, I had this realization, there's some spells that don't seem to quite work, but I put it on the back burner. Turns out putting it on the back burner kind of bit me in my ass. They reached the same fallacy. So I just sort of happened to discover the first fallacy again while just thinking about it on my couch 14 years later, right? What I started to do then was to think about how the schools were classifying themselves. And the thing that's interesting about having reached the same fallacy in 2 different ways is not because like the system is just so fundamentally wrong you're bound to reach it. It's just because when you approach it from a certain perspective, you have a presupposition in mind that you might not even know that you have. Like, for instance, think about how you experience the schools of magic in Skyrim and the other Elder Scrolls games for that matter. You want to restore health? Well, then go to Restoration. Oh, you want to do damage or something? Well, okay, you can use Destruction if you want to do it directly, but if you want something else to do damage, maybe go to Conjuration. Especially when you consider Oblivion's spell-making system, where even if you make for yourself an entirely new spell, it still gets sorted into one of the 5 or one of the 6 categories, right? That experience in the game establishes or can very easily establish the presupposition that the schools of magic's primary directive would be to classify spells. This isn't necessarily true. There's nothing that says that must be the primary directive. Not only do you reach the first fallacy, but you can continue to experience more fallacies like I experienced with trying to go down the idea with intention when using this perspective. I said that we had 2 problems. Well, the first problem isn't that we don't know how the schools are classifying themselves. That's the presupposition that we had that's so wrong. The 2 problems that we have is that we don't know what the primary function of the schools are, and that there seems to be some problem with the actuation of the schools in the world. When I was thinking about this by myself, I was struggling. I had no idea. I got stuck with the first fallacy. I had no idea where to go from then. So my first thought was that, I'm gonna just call up all my homies and see what they think. Man, I was calling up homies that didn't know shit about the Elder Scrolls. Like, I called my best friend Marsh. Marsh does not really know the Elder Scrolls lore like that, but his brother does. And so I called up Marsh and he was like, I don't know, dog. So I was like, put your brother on the phone. And his brother came up. I was like, hey brother, does this make any motherfucking sense? And he was the one that first reminded me that the schools were first brought to like sort of public renown by the Mages Guild of Cyrodiil. Because the schools like existed, but like as like a thing that cultures participated in. And they, like the British Museum, kind of consolidated them all. Typically you would say stolen, but I'm willing to let it slide because it's good for humanity this time or something. I don't know. Not important. But him telling me that was what allowed me to go from the first fallacy into the second fallacy by the idea of intention. Once I realized that the second fallacy was actually a second fallacy, it took me a little bit longer until I could realize that it was a problem with the presupposition. And so then it became a question of, okay, if the school's first primary directive isn't to classify something, then what is their first primary directive? And again, I didn't know the answer. I was struggling for this quite a lot, especially considering the fact that I had a weird obsession with not looking anything up. I don't know why. The reason I was able to actually get an answer to this was, once again, thanks to Marsh's brother, his reminder about the Mage's Guild of Cyrodiil, but more particularly, it came about when I was reconsidering the way that the Mage's Guild of Cyrodiil structures itself. They, if you don't know, have a branch in each major city of Cyrodiil, and each branch specializes in a school of magic. Why have a specialization? Isn't that kind of bad for your guild if you want everybody to be able to experience, as much magic as possible? Get them hooked on the fucking Scientology, then they're in, they can't leave, right? Not to mention the fact that if we understand the first fallacy and what it tells us, it sort of suggests that the schools aren't something that's so hard set, right? We see things moving about in them constantly. So why are they specializing in the schools? I mean, it couldn't be from like a purely cultural standpoint. I mean, maybe it could, but that didn't really make a lot of sense to me because the Mages Guild isn't made up of a bunch of different representatives from different cultures. It's not like there's a bunch of reachmen who were practicing a relatively obscure form of alteration or something like that who decided to represent their culture. It's not like the UN. It's just the Mages Guild. And so on top of the questions that this reconsideration of the guild structure were spawning, I also at the same time had remembered a piece of literature in Skyrim that I kind of forgot about for a while, and this is a book called A Tragedy in Black. There's a particular line in this book that I think sort of once again reminded me of a concept that we've talked about, but also seems to be very important. And the line is that, magic requires 4 things: thought, intention, will, and emotion. And to be fair, this is not a very trustworthy source at all. If you don't know, A Tragedy in Black is a story about a Dremora who is summoned by a young wizard who then tricks that young wizard and kills him. Also, the wizard was trying to summon a gift for his mother, which seems about the most nuclear option you could possibly take. I'm pretty sure you could have just given her a hug and a morning breakfast if you couldn't get nothing else, and she would have been all right with that. What do I know? I'm just a teenage dirtbag. But this concept was one, again, that we've talked about before, where magic seems to be this thing that is deeply personal and individualistic. And this spawns a couple of very interesting questions of itself in regards to the schools of magic, but also when combined with the structure of the Mages Guild. If magic is truly so individualistic that from mage to mage, you are essentially going to have your entire own experience different than anybody else's experience, then what is the benefit of the schools of magic for an individual mage? Essentially, you can't have standardization in a medium of expression which inherently relies on individualism without that standardization ultimately limiting the individuals in that medium. Essentially, the larger the standard, the lesser the individual. One of the things that I noticed immediately was that these 2 new questions align themselves eerily similar to the 2 main problems we were having. The fact that we don't know what the school's primary function is, and also that there seems to be some weirdness with the way the schools are functioning in the real world as people perceive them. When you combine these 4 things, you get an answer which seems to make perfect sense. And so finally, after all of this time of back and forwardness and just confusing narrative, we can get an answer to our main question of what the schools of magic are doing and why they're actually not that weird at all. So let's consider our first main problem. What are the school's primary function? And why is the Mages Guild structuring itself in such a weird manner? If we consider the fact that magic is something that seems to be deeply individualistic, the Mages Guild probably is structuring itself in this way of having a branch specialize in a school of magic because, as a person, we have emotional ranges. We have the moods that we are usually in and the moods that we will usually go to for certain things. That's how we are as people. A mage is a person who can just use magic. But if magic is also deeply individualistic to a person, it kind of stands the reason that, of course, a mage is deeply influenced by their emotional range as a person. And so the branches are specializing in schools because if you are a new mage and have no idea what it takes to make or cast magic, you're going to have to understand yourself. You're going to have to understand your emotional range as a mage, but finding yourself is hard. Finding who you are as an individual is a task. So what these branches are trying to do is, if your emotional range as a mage aligns itself closely with the known school of magic, well then head to the branch which specializes in that school of magic. Who better to help you understand your flavor of magecraft? It's just to educate new mages. But this also leads into our second problem. If it's just to educate new mages, that doesn't answer the problem of what's going on with the actuation of the schools in the real world, and the combination with the question of, if magic is so individualistic, what is a school doing for an individual? When we combine this with our understanding that the Mages Guild is structuring itself to teach new mages, well, this explains itself. It's to teach new mages. The schools of magic are not schools which are dictating or defining theoretical laws or the way that spellcasting is functioning. It's not for that at all. That's too far past its scale. What it is an elementary introduction for new mages, but the second you get an understanding of who you are as a mage, you have to drop this system as quickly as you can. The proverbial cliff for the proverbial chickling, you feel me? The reason it feels so weird and why the schools seem to be actuating themselves in such a weird manner is because there are mages who are taking the schools past what the schools are designed for. They're not designed to be these structures which define who you are as a mage. They're a simple elementary introduction to spellcasting. Finally. I mean, shit, it took us a while, but we eventually got there. We finally have answered all the questions. I mean, we entered this video with the questions of what is going on with the spells, and we have an answer. It's these two conclusions that I could draw. That the schools are there to be an elementary introduction to teach new mages the basics of magic, and that it has a very particular issue that if you overscale it, it quickly becomes bad for both mages and for magic. And why Candlelight was important was because it was what gave me insight, or allowed me to have insight into what I was actually doing wrong. It is important to note that it isn't the only spell that exists in two categories which have never gone away. For instance, like Paralyze is in both illusion and alteration. There's also like absorption as well. And it was so special because it was special to me. So there you go. Sorry if that's not so fulfilling for you. And that's cool and everything, I guess, but if you've looked down at the runtime for this video, you might be asking yourself, if that's the answer, then what's the rest of the video about? And I swear to you, that is the answer. I'm not pulling the wool over your eyes or anything like that. That is the answer that I could come to. I've said that it took me a month and a half to get to making this video, and that is true, but it's not because it took me a month and a half to figure all this out. In fact, I figured this out in about like a week and a half to 2 weeks. What happened was my mic broke, and I had to order a new mic, but that mic didn't arrive on time, so I had to order another mic, but that mic also didn't arrive on time, so I had to order a third mic, which was an entirely different mic than I was gonna order, which is the one that you're listening to now, because it did get here. Fantastic. The thing is, though, that in all that time, in about a month and a half, probably closer to 2 months now, in that time it took for me to get the mic, I had entirely forgotten most of my points, and so I had to go through my script again, or all the stuff that I had been putting together a month and a half ago. The thing about putting this together without really doing any external research and just sort of trying to rely on mainly what you knew is there are going to be gaps in your knowledge, especially when a key piece of literature that basically explains your 2 points in full exists in a game you've never played. The revelation here is not that my 2 points are completely moot, it's that my points are pretty much true, except there's a couple of things that I didn't quite get right. So what this next part of the video is about is I want to show you the piece of evidence that I found, and it's so cool to me, but I want to show you the piece of evidence, and I also want to correct a couple of misunderstandings that I had when I came to the conclusions, because while the conclusions may be right, what this piece of literature basically shows is that if we show my work, it's not exactly the cleanest work ever. So, oh my god, it's just so cool to see this piece of literature. Okay, let's get into it. This piece of literature is called Proposal, Schools of Magic. Written by a woman, written by a sage named Gabrielle Benelli. And in it she says, I take an interest in matters of practical pedagogy. After casting about for a model upon which to reorganize our teaching text, I came upon the curriculum of the Shadastula Academy in Morrowind, where they teach magic in 8 different disciplines. Though the divisions between disciplines, or schools of magic, are rather arbitrary, magic being an entirely mutable art, this classification of spellcasting into the schools of magic has the advantage of providing students with a structure for easy comprehension of the basics of wizardry. I don't know about you, but this was the coolest shit ever to read. Okay, I swear to you, I did not know this existed, but the way I went about this, it is so mind-blowing. Hello, this is further in the future, me, Scottish Birdman, Doctor. Yes, hello. I just wanted to say something real quick. And that's the line that the schools of magic are arbitrary because magic is an entirely mutable art. I've seen some people online take this to mean that, oh, magic is an entirely mutable art, so therefore all the schools of magic don't matter. I don't think that this is what this line is saying. I think it's kind of like saying, oh, your name is entirely arbitrary because it could have been any name ever. It didn't have to be what your name is. It could have been this other name. I think it's like that. It's not saying that your name has no meaning or the schools of magic have no meaning. All it's saying is that it could have been anything because magic is an entirely mutable art. So we could have chosen to view these schools from any perspective. This is what we happen to have defined the categories as. But as we grow and we understand the process that we need these schools to really participate in, we can change them as we see fit. In the same way that you might say, you know, you grow as a person and you might think that your name is fit to change. It doesn't mean that your name is therefore not meaningful. In fact, it's the opposite. Your name is very meaningful, so much so that you want to change it. It's not saying that the schools of magic are completely useless and have no meaning whatsoever, which I've seen people say. I just wanted to say that. Okay. Remember, I came to those two conclusions completely by myself and with the help of my friend and my friend's brother and my other friend who also doesn't know anything about Skyrim. I came to the conclusion, basically on my own, that those two things were true. That it was about teaching new magic to mages and that it needed to be scaled properly. This text almost entirely proves both of those as true, except it kind of hints at the overscaling issue in this one, but there's actually another one that I think will do it better. But I just think that the concept that you can come to this conclusion of what a system is doing in the universe of the Elder Scrolls simply by observing that system, especially when I had such a poor understanding of the schools of magic, is just so cool to me. You know, the fucking chest just speaks for itself. You know what I'm saying? I'll show you that the second piece of literature. It also comes from Miss Gabrielle Bonelli, and it's a piece called What's an Arcanist? Part 1. I don't know what part 2 is, but goddammit do I really, really, really want it, because this shit is the coolest shit to me. I'm having such a great time. I was so blown away when I read this. Okay. In it, she says, as an aside, I would invite readers to revisit my Schools of Magic proposal based on my time at the Shadastula Academy. While this ever-growing stack of rejection letters from Vanis Galarian likely means he still sees no interest in the subject, perhaps one of you will. I've already mentioned Vanis Galarian and why he's kind of an important guy, but, you know, the fact of the matter that one of the most powerful mages, one of the most influential mages of all time, rejected the concept of the schools of magic kind of makes one naturally wonder as to why. Why is this guy, a guy who would supposedly very deeply understand how important individualism is in magic, reject the concept of the schools of magic? I don't know this guy, so when I say these next things, I am talking completely out of the side of my fucking neck. I do not know him, and I do not know if this is true. This is what they call an assumption, brother. That's from me. Okay, check it. I think it kind of stands to reason. He views the schools of magic as very potentially limiting for mages because he understands that true spellcasting comes from the individual. So a standard such as this could actually prove detrimental to mages. And if they can never break from the system, then, well, we actually won't have any good mages at all. And while I think that that is a fair assumption, assuming that it's true, I think that it actually kind of works in another way. There's a potential for it to work in a different way. Imagine a mage whose first introduction into true magic is having had to first break out of a system of standardization. It's basically like, hey, by the way, if you ever want to do or be a true mage, you have to forget everything we just talked to you about. You have to forget it all. That seems like it's a very poetic system. It's great. It's like dramatic or whatever, right? Maybe Vanis Galarian had the right idea of things. He's clearly more knowledgeable about magic than I am, but I like to think that that's a pretty cool idea. And These two things seem to answer basically both of my problems altogether. Another thing I want to address is the fact that I didn't really provide a lot of evidence to make the case that magic is individualistic to person. All I said was that I got the idea again from A Tragedy in Black. There is a line of dialogue in ESO from a character called Loremaster Solaris, where he talks about magic being an individualistic thing from person to person. To be fair, this is also anecdotal evidence stacked on top of a very unreliable source in A Tragedy in Black, which is unreliable because it's an unreliable character and also it's probably a fictional book. So basically what I want to point out is that I do not have enough evidence to suggest that magic is for sure an individualistic experience from mage to mage. I do think that, but I don't know that. So keep that in mind, please. There's kind of one last thing that's still hanging in the air. Yes, we understand that if the system is not scaled properly, it'll actually limit mages. But there's actually a lot of things that we see people speak in the universe that kind of suggest that nobody has a true grasp on the system. And this is the last thing that I never could really understand. Like, even if the system isn't that widely understood, especially outside of the Mages Guild, you still have people who would be called masters of magic, calling themselves a master restorationist or a master destructionist or something like this. And this didn't really make sense to me if everybody understood that the schools were just that, schools of magic. And that's another thing, by the way. It was looking me in my face the entire time, since I was 11, that they're the schools of magic. Schools of magic. Like, how obvious is that, right? I always took the concept of school as like this concept of higher learning. Like, it's a specific avenue for individual higher learning. No, it kind of seems to be the opposite, right? It kind of seems to be just the schools of magic. And this kind of leads me to my next point, why the issue of overscaling seems to be so prominent in the world. I think it's that actually it's not over prominent at all. I think the system is pretty much scaled great. There are still instances we see people misusing it, but I think for the vast majority of people, let's take the College of Winterhold, for example. You go there and you meet people who call themselves Master of Restoration, or as she likes to fucking remind us all the time, Master of Restoration, Master of Destruction, all that sort of stuff. And under the concept of the schools that the Mages Guild implements, I would kind of assume that, they're calling themselves a master because they're in the position of tutor. They're a mentor to the students of their class, in that emotional range as a mage or whatever, right? That kind of concept. But actually, I think it's actually in two parts. Yes, they are that too, and they definitely could be getting called master from that perspective, but I think you have to remember that the Mages Guild didn't create the schools of magic. Even the Shadowstula didn't create the schools of magic. What they did was they created a particular educational curriculum. And in that, they used names and words and concepts that existed prior. When you ask yourself where they existed, well, of course, they existed with particular cultures. There were people who practiced these concepts. They get together, they group together, and they call themselves, mystics, the Sigic order. They practice mysticism. There's no chance that they thought that mysticism was just a school of magic that needed to be dropped, 5 years into learning or whatever. Clearly the mystics or the Sigics view themselves as practitioners of mysticism. So I think schools of magic exist in two parts. They exist from the perspective of the schools of magic, in which this kind of concept of the why is ward and restoration talk still doesn't make sense. It doesn't make sense whatsoever because that's obviously not what it's about there. But they also exist in this colloquial cultural perspective of these individual pursuits of group identity, where the Sigics are mystics and the Reachmen were whatever the fuck the Reachmen were. I think they were alterationists or something like that. And even still in that concept, it doesn't make sense to ask the question of why is ward and restoration, because it's insane behavior to think that because a group is practicing a generalized concept of learning, that therefore they can't ever break from it. Like, imagine you had two different groups, and one of the groups was about destroying all plants on Earth, and the other group was about growing all plants on Earth. It's insane to think that therefore because this group's about destroying all plants on Earth that they would never grow a plant. It's completely acceptable to think that they would practice something that seems to be in a different group identity's wheelhouse. When you ask the question of why is ward and restoration, well, the restorationist of the cultural identity would call you a fucking idiot, because who gives a shit? I'm trying to protect myself, I'm trying to heal, of course it makes sense. Just as they're likely to cast a spell which wraps somebody in quote-unquote mage armor. It makes as much sense for them to do that as an alterationist. But an alterationist would have a different idea of it. Maybe they're not about mage armor, quote-unquote, maybe they're about transmutating the skin into a different material, like iron or something like that. It makes perfect sense that both of these groups could be into that. But the thing is, there are still people who do say these things in universe. One of the best pieces of evidence to support this is a book called Response to Biro's Speech. And Response to Biro's Speech is a lovely piece of lore. It really is quite fantastic. There was a person named Biravar Biro. First off, holy fucking shit, dude. Biravar Biro? Are we out of our fucking mind? Who named you that? Because that's fucking ridiculous. I'm not gonna say anything more about it than that. You know, I don't want to disrespect him too personally, but holy fucking shit, dude. Anyway, so Biravar Biro gave a speech detailing why they thought that destruction wasn't a true school of magic. And they actually said that they believed destruction should be merged with alteration. This concept of merging schools is absolutely fucking insane from any perspective. The only time it makes sense, no, sorry, actually, let me correct that. It never fucking makes sense at all. Ever. Like, even when considering that the schools of magic are about what spells are doing, it makes no sense. If you think magic is about the intention of the mage, you're out of your fucking mind. We need as many fucking schools as we can get our grubby little fucking hands on. They're over here talking about mixing shit together. No, you're fucking insane. We're not doing that. So that doesn't make sense for that either. It doesn't make sense from the schools of magic from the Mages Guild perspective because, again, why would we converge these like the school of magic of destruction and the school of magic of alteration, which are clearly so differently opposed? They're not about what spells are doing or this generalized concept of learning. They're about introducing novice mages to the basics of magic, and especially when you consider it from the perspective of a cultural learning, a group identity. Imagine going to a group of people and telling them, you don't deserve to exist because you share similarities with this group of people over here. Brother, you're going to get your ass whooped. You're going to get your ass whooped from wherever you decided to come into that community to wherever they decide you need to leave it. You're going to get fucked up. Why is he making this suggestion? And the answer is, he's fucking ignorant. He's an ignoramus ass motherfucker. And in the Battle Mage Malvisor, who authored Response to Biro's Speech, says as much. He dragged this motherfucker over the coals for good fucking reason. We stand Malvisor in this household. Biravar Biro and his dumb fucking name needs to get his ass whooped in whatever town he shows up in. Dumbass motherfucker. The only problem that I have with Malvisor's response is Malvisor continuously jabs into the concept of oh, he's an illusionist. He's a dirty illusionist. Of course an illusionist would say that. It's all about tricking the mind. And that's kind of like a quippy response, but it's also of course he's a dirty fucking, cultural guy, imagine if I said, of course he's a dirty Mexican. Only a Mexican would say that. Brother, I should be lambasted. There's a cross somewhere with my name on it, flipped around, burning alive with me on it. You know what I'm saying? If I say some shit like that, it's not okay to be racist and segregationist to a group of people just because he's ignorant, and he is ignorant, believe me. But regardless of whatever the hell I feel about this, I do think that this Response to Biro's Speech is one of the coolest things that we see in the universe, because it is saying that even with these two understandings of what these schools of magic could be, there are still people who have an ignorant viewpoint, just like there are people in real life, ding 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 my fucking self, that have an ignorant viewpoint of the schools of magic. And honestly, I don't really have anything else more to say about the schools of magic. If you didn't understand the schools of magic, hopefully you do now. If you had these same misconceptions that I did, and by the way, I know a lot of you did. I've seen the internet. I've since looked at my past mistakes. I've studied the sources. You people don't understand magic as well as I didn't understand magic. But regardless, I hope you had a good time. I'm sorry I fucking ran. Well, I'm not sorry I ran a lot. Am I fucking out of my fucking mind? That's it. That's the end of the video. Goodbye. I almost said go fuck yourself, but I didn't mean that. But goodbye. I'm out. Go. Ah!